All right. Hey, everybody. I am here with Andrew Sepielli, and we're going to be talking about metaethics and just kind of philosophy more generally today. So, Andrew, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, and whatever it is you want to say to just, make your welcome.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Lance. So I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto. I work on normative ethics and metaethics. Also starting to get interested in the bearings of empirical psychology and neuroscience upon, especially methodological matters in normative ethics. But yeah, I mean, for the past 7-8 years or so, I've been working on a book that kind of explains my metaethical views. It's called Pragmatist Quietism. It just got published on late 2022. And I'm sure we'll get into kind of specifics of my views and your views on these matters. But yeah, just in the process of talking to various people about the book and the contents of it, I came across your YouTube channel and your website, and I just thought that the way that you were discussing these sorts of metaethical issues was, I think, probably more forthright and strident than one often comes across in conferences where everybody's in a philosophy department. And maybe other metaethicists kind of don't like that kind of kind of straightforward give and take, but I actually love it. I wish there was a lot more of it. And so yeah, I was interested in just chatting with you about areas of agreement, areas of disagreement.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. To give a little context and background of my own. So I just finished up about 7-8 years of working on a PhD in social psychology. And often I think that strikes some people as a little strange that I then have a YouTube channel and a blog where I'm talking about metaethics all day. So It's like, wait, why are you talking about philosophy if you're a psychologist? But my background in psychology was actually motivated in part to do it because I have an interdisciplinary interest, and my own area of research is the psychology of metaethics. And it's not a big area, and I've been kind of just deep in the wilderness looking at the psychology of how non-philosophers think about metaethics for a long time. And I think kind of emerging from the wilderness and back more into the world of philosophy after having spent nearly a decade in psychology, it's given me a very different perspective. I think my perspective is already different. I mean, I went into psychology in a way, in part to do philosophy, so that already sets me apart in some ways. But yeah, my perspective ended up, I found to be quite divergent. And I think part of what you might see in me being strident or having maybe a more blunt perspective on some realist issues surrounding realism and anti-realism comes from me thinking in part that the way that the dialectic is framed, it might be that a lot of people are more inclined at conferences and discussions to be more polite, but I think part of it is just that a lot of the anti-realists that are currently working within contemporary analytic metaethics, a lot of them already buy into a lot of the presuppositions, the methods, and the sort of assumptions and attitudes that characterize that discourse. And so it's like, okay, it's like they agree on a bunch of things and then they disagree sort of at the periphery, which for them, maybe realism and anti-realism isn't a periphery. But for me, I also disagree with a lot of the foundational assumptions behind the dialectic itself. And so, for instance, even an anti-realist might concede that if you're an error theorist, you're biting the bullet or you're conceding something that we might want out of a realist theory, but that you're paying a cost to embrace error theory. And I don't typically think of the anti-realist positions that are available as paying heavy theoretical costs, as having these undesirable consequences. So I don't even see them as biting bullets. I guess that might be a helpful way to start sharing from my own point of view why I kind of have that attitude. But I think there is some resonance between, just sort of superficially, I see that the title of your work, Pragmatist Quietism, and I've used the terms pragmatism and quietism quite a lot, but I'm expecting that we're going to find differences in spite of that fact. Like, just because there's the labels doesn't mean that we conceive of views a little as the same. So I'm curious where you stand sort of broadly with respect to like what you argue for and how you set things up in your work.
Right. And you're this issue about whether you're biting a bullet in saying that there are no, I guess, no moral truths, or that nothing is right or wrong, or however you want to characterize error theory, is an interesting one. Um, um, I don't know. Like, maybe should we talk about? Should I talk about like stuff in my stuff that I like believe, or should we talk about that like very thing that you just?
However you want to do it, I'm happy to talk about that. Sure.
Well, maybe I'll just like say something about like my broad perspective. I'm not going to go through all the stuff. I mean, it'll come out, I'm sure, as we have a conversation. So um, the pragmatist stuff in the book actually comes later on. It's in some sense it's like the core of the book, but in some sense it's like you kind of work your way up to it. But the basic idea behind quietism is that ethics is an autonomous domain of inquiry, right? So what's right or wrong or good or bad is sort of unaffected, if you want to put it that way, by metaphysics and semantics and epistemology and so forth. And so, we should not be jettisoning our ethical views because of what the semanticist down the hall says about whether the term wrong refers. But nor should we be accepting some ethical view because it falls out of some kind of commitment in these other areas of philosophy. So that's kind of essentially what quietism is. And there are many different routes to quietism, right? So if you think of other quietists like Tim Scanlon, Ronald Dworkin, John McDowell, a lot of them out there. So there are many different routes into it. Basically, I'm a quietist because I think that ethical disputes work in a very different way than I think most other philosophers think they work. Basically, I think they're really similar to the kinds of disputes that tend to get called merely verbal or non-substantive. The example I keep going back to in my book is the one from William James's Pragmatism book, where the man is chasing a squirrel around a tree, right? And James and his friend both see this happening, and one of them says, "Oh, the man is not only is the man chasing the squirrel around the tree, but the man is thereby going around the squirrel," right? And then the other person says, "No, no, 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 no. The man isn't going around the squirrel," right? And they have this, it seems to me what's happening is that they're using the term around the squirrel in different ways. Or how to diagnose exactly what's going on, like kind of semantically, is another question. But there's something about that sort of disagreement that seems like it's not really about the world. And I actually think that ethical disputes are like that, but we're sort of confused and tempted into seeing them as being more like ordinary substantive disputes about, maybe my wife and I are, asking like, "Oh, are there any clean socks in the dryer?" or something like that. And so anyway, there's kind of more to say about that, but it's like I have a certain kind of view about what's going on in ethical disputes, and then there's a bunch of kind of theoretical overlay that I put on top of that, and then wind up with this quietist position. It's also part of my view. It's not part of quietism as such, but it's part of my view that ethical truths are stance independent, right? So I think that for example, I don't know, like kind of inclined towards utilitarianism. So let's stick with that, right? I mean, I think that one ought to engage in behavior that promotes overall well-being, so independently of whether that is something of which I approve of in this world or any other possible world, and independent of whether that's something that my community approves of, or whether it's independent of whether some assessor thinks that, whatever. So again, you can be a quietist and not accept stance independence, but I do accept it. I think I see disputes about stance independence versus dependence as being actually kind of more like disputes within normative ethics rather than meta-ethical disputes. So I just think as a normative ethical theory, I'm, find stance independence more appealing than, stance independence more appealing than stance dependence, in the same way that I, find consequentialism more appealing than deontology. But it's kind of the overall kind of spiel,
Yeah, it's interesting because I've used this term quietism, but I'm not entirely sure the degree to which there is overlap and similarity in how people are using the term and how they're deploying the term and what people are quietists about. I've had some people suggest to me that quietism is a more broad and programmatic attitude towards philosophy as a whole, rather than it applying to specific issues. And so maybe something that might be helpful, because this is something that I suspect you've looked into a bit more than me, is could you say a bit more about quietism in a more general sense and how that relates to what you're doing?
Uh, I'll say something. I mean, I should say, and I'm not really a philosopher who's that. I mean, maybe this is a flaw, but that interested in like kind of positioning his work within, kind of previous kinds of outlooks. So like I don't have like a picture of Wittgenstein on my wall or even in my brain, right? I don't. So I think quietism is one of these terms that, and maybe this is just partly because of the kinds of people who tend to be attracted to quietism, is not always defined in the clearest way. I mean, broadly speaking, I think it's an attitude of, kind of skepticism about the very, possibility of pursuing these traditional philosophical questions in metaphysics or in epistemology, what some people maybe used to call the core areas of
Mhm.
philosophy. Um, you know, I mean, I'm like any other philosopher. Like I have my own kind of views about like, okay, which things, like what parts of metaphysics seem like to be in good order and which parts are not, and ditto for other subfields. But certainly, like in my own work, it's not like really a premise in my argument that metaphysics is bullshit, or like, I'm not saying I don't think that, but it's like that's not a premise in the argument that metaphysics is bullshit, or that you can't give a theory of meaning, as it were, from the outside, right, and without using terms that are semantic. That's not. Other people say stuff like that, and I think it's worth reading Phil Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations and like
Mhm.
John McDowell stuff and Stanley Cavell stuff. But that's not. I mean, my view is sort of, it's, if I had to call it something other than quietism, it would be like automatism. I mean, I think it kind of falls out of my kind of view that like ethics really is this kind of autonomous sphere, and any kinds of like legitimate moves are just moves being made within ethics, like the same kind of dispute basically that um, the person who says, turn the trolley, and the person who says no, like don't turn the trolley, or having like that same kind of dispute is like basically what I think any kind of um, relevant dispute about ethics is, whether it's stance independence versus independence, or questions about who the moral experts are, or anything like that. I think it's all ethics.
Cool. Yeah, I think I feel similarly about how I position my position within the broader framework of like philosophy as a whole, both with respect to metaphysics, but also even within metaethics itself. I mean, one of the things that might be distinctive about my own anti-realist position is that it doesn't fit into any of the sort of traditional categories. So the place I take my cues from for a really straightforward articulation of the range of metaethical positions available is Mike Huemer's ethical intuitionism. And at the outset of that, Huemer just says, look, you got 5 options for metaethics. You've got naturalist realism, non-naturalist realism, expressivism, error theory, relativism. Those are your only options. And the way he does define relativism in a way that seems to include like constructivist accounts that like
Right.
have
Yeah.
the morals be stance dependent. And so like, I don't know, maybe ideal observer theory and some other stuff would fall into there, and maybe some
Mm-hmm.
forms of divine command theory. I think he might even explicitly mention that. But in any case, so it is like exhaustive of most of the positions out there, but it's not exhaustive of my position. And that's part of where, for me, I've used this term quietism just because it was the best sort of available term I could find that what seemed to have similar origins and what was motivating it and how I was deploying it. And specifically, my concern and the reason I don't fall within that framework has to do with something that you referenced earlier. Like we might not care so much when doing ethics. Like your perspective on it being autonomous, I may or may not endorse that. I suspect I probably wouldn't. But I think where I might agree, if we do find this to be a point of agreement, is I don't think that the meta-ethicists, whether they're a realist or anti-realist, should care that much about what the semanticist down the hall has to say about ordinary language. And this is why I wouldn't call myself an error theorist. Even though I don't endorse expressivist and relativist semantic accounts, and I don't think that there are stance-independent moral facts, I'm not an error theorist because I think error theory cleaves too closely to endorsing both a semantic thesis and a metaphysical thesis. And so the error theorist, well, I typically see it as a kind of conjunction of at least two claims. You could probably throw some other claims in there if you want to. But like, so the error theorist says, okay, it's both a semantic thesis about ordinary moral language. Ordinary moral language is committed to these stance-independent moral facts, but there are no such facts. So ordinary moral language is systematically in error. My problem isn't there are no stance-independent moral facts. I endorse that. My problem is the semantic thesis. But part of where I end up being more strident is because when an error theorist endorses error theory, they often seem to be either characterized by their opponents or even acknowledge themselves that the way that they speak about morality somehow is subordinate to the commitments implicit in ordinary moral language. So they'll say something like, ordinary people, when they say murder is wrong, they're committed to these objective moral facts. And so I don't think there are any moral facts. There are no moral facts because murder is wrong just means murder is stance independently wrong. Well, because nothing is stance independently wrong, then the sentence murder is wrong is false. And so then the realist will come along and criticize them and say, look, you error theorists, you don't even think murder's wrong. So you can't say murder's wrong. Here's the thing. Yeah, I'm not an error theorist. I can say murder is wrong. I could say whatever I want because hold in to the presuppositions implicit in ordinary moral language. If ordinary people use moral language a particular way, I'm not obligated to speak with to share their presuppositions. I could just drop some of the presuppositions. Compared to physics, if like folk physics had it rejected like relativity and it rejected various elements of physics, we would you wouldn't say that I can't talk about motion as a physicist. Like you can't say I went to the store. You can't say you went to the store because you don't accept the ordinary view of motion as non-relative, and you think motion is relative. So, and then if they say no, but I went to the store, but relative to the other objects in the world, then you're being revisionist about your language. Yeah, I am. Too bad. So that's why I have an issue with error theorists, because I think they both subordinate their discourse to ordinary language too much, and they expose themselves in a way that they don't challenge the critics, the realist critics. And this is why I bring up normative entanglement and that sort of stuff. When someone says the error theorist can't say murder is wrong, the implication, the only thing the error theorist is committed to is, hey, ordinary people basically think morality is, from my point of view, magical. There is no magic, and so the ordinary view is wrong. That has nothing to do with their attitude towards murder, their behavior, their personal conduct, what they vote for, the policies they care about, how they treat their friends and family. It's not like the error theorists, because they don't think the sentence murder is wrong as a feature of ordinary language is true, therefore they have no problem with murder. They could be very opposed to murder. They just have a problem with the presupposed metaphysics. So that is where I come in with this language metaphysics thing is really weird.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I mean, it's often the case, these kind of cleavages arise in certain ways, and what you end up with is a theoretical landscape that kind of feels almost like a kind of poorly fitting shirt or something like that. You just kind of wish it could be re-sewn or whatever. And I think the kind of error theory that you're talking about is maybe kind of an example of that. So, I mean, there are all sorts of possible arguments for the conclusion that, however you want to put it, there are no moral facts, nothing's right or wrong. And some of them are just they're kind of concerns about ontological profligacy or something, right? It's it doesn't seem like, whether numbers or propositions play a role in the best explanation of the world. So, there are no such things. You might say the similar thing about values or reasons or whatever, right? They don't play this kind of role. And so, we shouldn't be admitting them into our ontology. Well, that's a kind of argument that doesn't seem, to me at least, to rely on any claims about what, how ordinary speakers are using moral terms. It's just like, like basically moral stuff is like, doesn't really help us explain stuff. So it's like with, numbers and propositions. The kind of this sort of insistence that like, okay, ordinary speakers, like when they say stuff is wrong, they mean that it's objectively wrong. They're kind of committed to that. That is the fact that like that becomes such a huge part of error theory kind of discourse, I think stems from the fact that it was an argument in John Mackey's, J.L. Mackey's specific argument for error theory, where his problem, I mean, I have to say, I am not a fan of, Mackey's, ethics inventing right or wrong. I just think it's like the arguments are like sketchy, or like, I don't exactly know what he's arguing, but insofar as I do know what he's arguing, I just think it's like in many cases, the arguments are very bad. But I mean, his argument, at least one of his arguments for error theory, was this sort of idea that like the problem wasn't like ontological profligacy. The problem was, okay, the problem is specifically with, objective values or objective moral norms, because there wouldn't be the right kind of connection with motivation, and values out there have to be like both, as he put it, objective and prescriptive, but they can't be both, right? And we know they've got to be prescriptive, so they can't be objective. We could kind of talk more about the argument why I think it's bad, but like that particular aspect of contemporary error theory, I think, is really just kind of attributable to Mackey's book. But if you look at other like error theorists, I don't think that they always like have that kind of commitment, because their roots to error theory are like very different. Like is it Strumer or Stroimer? I should know this in my field, like Bart Strumer stuff, or like Jonas Olson's book. Like I don't think they're kind of using that same commitment. So I'd be curious as to whether you'd be like willing to sign on to error theory if there was if it was like shorn of what seems to me like an kind of optional commitment. Like you don't have to say something about ordinary people's way of talking, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would. So I would accept some type of minimal, like I think if you remove the semantic thesis, I don't see it as error theory anymore. It's just the rejection of realism.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and it would be weird to characterize. And also, I see like I really don't like it being called the error theory, because one, I just think it's, you know what, this is goofy, but it reminds me of the Batman. I just prefer Batman, not the Batman. I know that's goofy. Right. It just aesthetically, I don't like it. But yeah, that's a ridiculous concern to raise. But whatever, I'm going to keep it in here. But also, error theory I see it as at least like potentially a category of type of anti-realist positions, because error theory, I don't take it to be a requirement of error theory that the problem be that there is a mistaken metaphysical presupposition implicit in ordinary language. You could have error theories that ground the error theoretic concern in some other presupposition. It could be something like all ordinary moral claims presuppose libertarian free will. There is no libertarian free will. Therefore, all first order ordinary moral claims are false. Or all ordinary moral claims presuppose the existence of God, or that moral claims express God's commands. God doesn't exist. So as long as you end up having this pairing between a semantic thesis, moral claims mean this, and then because they have a false presupposition, they are systematically false. Those all strike me as types of error theory. So really, I think we should be talking about error theories as a category. And then I think Mackey could be credited with this particular type, like maybe both introducing the idea of an error theory and this particular error theoretic view, which is based on specifically the claim that something like ordinary moral claims presuppose objective prescriptivity, that there is no such thing, that's metaphysically suspicious, and so those claims are false. There's two things. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm like, so it's interesting. We're kind of thinking about these, just like the dividing lines here a little bit differently. I mean, I mean, I find error theory like that, like the term a little bit weird. I mean, like anything where you introduce the term to like just your friends and family, and then you have to be like, and here's why it's called error theory. Right? It's like it's kind of not always the best label when it has to be explained every time. But I guess the way, if I were like an error theorist, I would think, okay, the error is basically like there are people going around, they think stuff is right or wrong, but yo, they're all in error because nothing's right or wrong, and like the error is just that. And I wouldn't rely on any kind of presupposition, like on any thoughts about like, okay, ordinary discourse presupposes, is there any kind of semantic claims. I think if I were an error theorist, I would kind of present my argument like this. I'd be like, look, truths require truth makers, right? And it's partly constitutive of the truth makers for moral claims that there are these things have these moral properties, but there are no moral properties. So it's not like discourse presupposes this. It's just like this is required. Or I would just, if I were somebody who thought that moral truth required God, I would just be like, it wouldn't be like ordinary moral discourse presupposes believing. I would just argue like, look, God doesn't exist, and God has to exist for morality to exist. So morality doesn't exist. Or I might say something like, if I were like Elizabeth Anscombe or something, it might be like, look, the moral ought has to have a sense in order for anything to be what you morally ought to do or ought not to do. It doesn't have a sense, and so there's nothing that you morally ought to do or ought not to do. So, if I were an error theorist, like if I were an error theorist or just a kind of a moral nihilist, I would not be kind of running my argument through some claim about like what ordinary discourse presupposes. I mean, people might do that. I just like that thing that's like it's a thorn. I mean, it's a bad tactic for all sorts of reasons, but I think part of it just like opens up to like these, people like you saying like, look, we can actually see what ordinary discourse presupposes, right? And maybe it'll turn out that it doesn't. People are not presupposing this, right? Philosophers are making it up.
Right. Yeah. And so I'm very much sympathetic to the semantic part. I don't know if I would go in for some type of I know you're saying like conditional on being an error theorist. Here's how I would do it. Yeah. I at least think what you're proposing is better than what error theorists actually do. I do want to, at least for our audience's sake, make clear. Mackey is very clear that his thesis does include a claim about ordinary moral language. So I did have a quote ready. This is from Walter Sinnott Armstrong's paper, Mixed Up Metaethics. It's a really cool paper. But he quotes Mackey from Inventing Right and Wrong. It's page 33. It's the 1977 version. I think it's the same version I have. Anyway, here's what Mackey says. The ordinary user of moral language means to arises morally. For example, a possible action, as it is in itself, or would be if it were realized, and not about or even simply expressive of his or anyone else's relation to it. And so Mackey's very clear that part of the goal here is to characterize what ordinary speakers are trying to use the language to do. And what Sinnott Armstrong does in this paper, because this is a paper that's a response to Gill's paper on indeterminacy and variability, or it might be a response to Don Loeb's on incoherentism, or maybe it's a response to all of them. There's this sort of similar cluster of views that are very much inspired my own perspective and even my pursuit of the empirical research, where these views sort of reject the uniformity and the determinacy of ordinary moral language. So what Sinnott Armstrong does here is he says, look, there is very little doubt that what 20th century metaethicists were doing, Ayer, Hare, Mackey, all of them, not necessarily all of them, but at least the ones he quotes, really do take themselves to be describing ordinary moral language. And so part of the reason I emphasize this, and I refer to this paper a lot, is because some of the times when I have discussions like this one, people will say, well, maybe they don't really say that. Maybe you're mischaracterizing what they think. I've said like this philosopher is making a claim about what ordinary people mean. And then I've had people say, no, they're not. And then I have to find a quote from the person saying, or my position is that ordinary people mean this. And it's like, well,
no, I acknowledge that Mackey is doing that. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. No. I know we're not disagreeing. I'm saying this for the audience's sake, just because I sometimes get people jumping up saying like, maybe Mackey's not doing that. No, Mackey's Mackie has a semantic thesis here. And yeah, I do think it's strange because I don't think they need the thesis. They could just drop it. And I think it eliminates a vulnerability that at very little theoretical cost. So I think we're on the same page about that. If I was an error theorist, I would drop the semantic claim. But then, yeah, as you raise, I mean, my own stuff, I've done empirical research on this. Other people have done empirical research on this. It's not like settled. Settling anything in psychology takes decades and decades and lots of really dedicated research. It's a small area of research, but you might think at least the initial data would be really promising. Like we go and ask people, hey, do you think morality is subjective? And then like if 92% of people said, yeah, I think it is, I would take a look. It doesn't have to be 100% to satisfy me. My standards aren't that high, but it's not 92%. It's a complete chaotic mess where the same person would say it's objective in some contexts and not in others, for some issues, but not others. If you train them in the relevant distinctions, then suddenly they seem to move towards anti-realism for some reason. I don't know if I would have predicted that, but like you get the I don't know if you saw this paper, but I think it's one of the most important papers in the field. It's a paper by Pulsler and Wright called Anti-Realist Pluralism, and they put people through like.
Is that Jennifer Wright? Jennifer
Yes,
Cole Wright? Okay.
Yeah,
I haven't read that paper. I read something else that she did with like I think like Hagup Sarkeesian and there's like a bunch of co-authors. But yeah, sorry.
Are you talking about the folk moral relativism paper?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the one where they present people with a moral disagreement between themselves and a member from like their culture, a member from a different culture, and then an extraterrestrial.
Right. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, that is I love that paper. It's such a fun paper. I do critique it in my dissertation, but I still love the paper. Yeah, we should just mention. Do you want to talk about the findings? I can talk about the findings. I think it's a cool paper. Maybe it's.
You should present the findings. I remember reading it, and when you like said, "Oh, here's what the findings were," I was like, "Oh yeah, I remember that." Yeah.
It's such a fun paper. We should tell people about it. Okay, so and I'll be quick on this. I know sometimes I get really excited and I'll go for like a long time. Okay, so what they do in this paper is they present the participants with moral disagreements between themselves and then a person from the same culture, a different culture, or extraterrestrials. Their description of the extraterrestrials is really fun. They call them, they're called pentars, and their only goal in life, they don't care about suffering or pain or death. They just want to convert all matter in the universe into equilateral pentagons. So they give this really goofy explanation. I enjoy it, although I do think you need to be careful when you're constructing a study and you want a serious response. If you give people something too ridiculous, they might not take it seriously. And I suspect participants probably didn't. So I do think they could have given more serious sounding aliens, but hey, it was fun. So what they did is they asked people these questions. So it could be something like, is murder wrong? The scenarios are a little more complicated than that. So if you and another person from the same culture disagree about murder, can you both be correct, or must at least one of you be incorrect? And then people would say, or give a pretty high rate of saying, yeah, at least one of us is incorrect. The other person, murder's not okay. If you describe a member of a different culture, that rate of it's measured as a type of as realism. Like the realism rate goes down, and the relativism rate goes up as you move towards a disagreement between you and a member of a very different culture. And then when it's a disagreement between you and the extraterrestrial, the relativism rate goes up even higher and the realism rate goes down even further. And so what they argue is that it's disposed towards giving a realist response to metaethical questions, and they're more disposed towards giving a relativist response. It's a neat finding.
Sorry, the audio cut out for like the last like 10 seconds. So what's the take? What's the conclusion that they draw or their explanation of this?
Sure. Sorry about that. They argue that with increasing cultural distance, people are more disposed to give relativist judgments rather than realist judgments towards moral issues.
Okay. Yeah. And is there a kind of proposed explanation? As you know, I've looked at the paper once of why that is.
I don't recall exactly what their proposed explanation for that is. What I can say, though, there are a few issues methodologically. So if you're members of the same culture and you're a cultural relativist, it's actually consistent with cultural relativism to think that the other person could be mistaken, even if you're a relativist. So there is that. I can't remember what they say, but a few things that could be going on, and maybe this is one of the things they suggest is that as a person tries to consider or take the perspective of people from another culture, that might cause them to reconsider their metaethical views and then respond in a way that reflects that reconsideration. So it could be a sort of impromptu reflection on differences between cultures that could explain it. There's probably some other explanations for that.
Yeah, I think part of, I mean, just kind of, guessing here, but that there might be some kind of status competition sort of element of it, right? So if it's like, if it's an alien, or you start telling me about the way they used to do things in like, ancient, Mesopotamia or whatever, it's like, I'm not really in a kind of competition with these people. So I'm okay to like, let them have their own sorts of views. It just doesn't cut into my sense of being, my sense of status to like let them have their views and not say they're wrong. But then if it's like people in the same kind of culture where we're kind of duking it out for status, right? It's like, they're saying that my voting patterns and way of living are wrong, and I'm saying that theirs are wrong. And it's like, I kind of feel like, okay, I have to like vanquish them, right, in order for my status to, kind of stay intact, right? It's not enough to have equipoise or a truce or something like that. So it's a
Yeah, that is actually pretty similar to a suggestion that Wright makes in subsequent papers,
oh,
where part of the proposal is that part of expressing relativist views is to sort of keep your options open. It's to navigate social interactions with people in a more effective way. I don't think I could characterize it off the top of my head super well, but there is the social element to it. I'm super sympathetic to those types of explanations, especially ones like you suggest, like the status driven thing. And this is something I bring up towards the end of my dissertation work, where I critique the existing empirical literature. And what I suggest is that a great deal of moral language, like part of the reason I think that we get such messy empirical findings where people sometimes seem to give realist answers and sometimes give anti-realist answers. I don't endorse pluralism. I don't think they really are kind of realist about some of the time and anti-realist some of the other time.
okay.
I think that language actually serves largely socio-functional purposes. People use realist sounding or anti-realist sounding language, like relativistic language, not because they have any principled commitment to these views or because they really have any deep philosophical views about any of this. Like, I don't think they do at all. I think that the language is more superficial and that it serves social purposes. You could, if you use realist language, it could make you sound committed to your values and strident, and it could be used to really helpfully condemn a person whose values you don't like. You could use relativist language to signal that you're a tolerant and respectful person towards members of other cultures, something like that. And so I think that people employ this language to achieve their social goals in different contexts, and that navigation, that employment for social goals is largely motivated by an implicit psychological predisposition to navigate social hierarchies and to improve one's status and reputation relative to one's competitors. So I'm very much on board with that type of explanation as really being the right. I mean, I literally argue for that. So I think that's a great explanation. I don't think they might propose that in the paper, but I don't think so. But we're on
Yeah.
the same page on that. That's cool.
Yeah, it's interesting. It kind of reminds me of a little bit of, I mean, again, we're kind of really in your wheelhouse and not mine, but there was a paper by maybe Beebe and some co-authors, right, about like how relativistic people are as they kind of go through their lives, right? And then it's like, okay, in high school, right, is it kind of, everybody gets like super, realist and like, oh, like abortion is wrong and that's just a fact or whatever. And then when they get into the university, right, like relativism goes way up. And I'm not sure what their explanation is in the paper. I'm sure they probably have one. I don't remember, but like at least one possible explanation is, okay, here you are in university, right? You're in a dorm with everybody else, right? You want to make friends. You don't want to seem like the pompous, ass who thinks like he has like the revealed truth about morality. And so, one way of, kind of navigating all that is to kind of treat these as, these things as relative, or they're matters of taste. They're things about which I could be right and you could also be right. For instance.
Yeah, it's so cool you know about the empirical literature on this. I rarely talk to anybody that knows about all this. Actually, the last person I did a video with was one of the authors on that paper,
Oh, okay.
David
Okay.
Sakris. So it's a Beebe and Sakris. I think it's called Objectivism Across the Lifespan.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, and they look at the overall realist and anti-realist response rates at different age groups. And yeah, you do get late teens through your up until around 30 is when it starts to dip again, of like a much higher, what you could say, anti-realist or relativist rate, depending on how you want to use the terminology here. And yeah, I mean, it's not at all clear why exactly this occurs, but it does appear to occur where people give these seemingly higher rates of anti-realist responses. And yeah, moving away from home, being around people from different, all of that seems like really plausible explanations. But there's like one study on this,
Right.
so
Yeah.
we're nowhere near really having a good explanation for how or why this would occur. But yeah, there's lots of plausible and I think fruitful speculation on why people might do this. And it's also it's the kind of thing that I think I would be much more concerned. I mean, I'm like super concerned about the measures. I don't buy into any of the measures, but it would be super weird if you didn't get that high rate of apparent relativism in your measures for college students and people around like college student age, like 18, 20. Because that'd be really weird, because when I ask my students, I've gotten as high as 100% students endorsing some type of relativism or anti-realism. So, and this is a common occurrence. It's like there's a whole literature on student relativism, which is really weird. I don't know if you've seen that literature, but the people writing about it really seem to not like student relativism. They're like, how can we stop students from being relativists? But
Yeah.
if that's their view, that's their view. So
What
there's
are
something
you
strange
thinking
about
of? What are you thinking of? Like what's the literature? Who are the?
I can't remember the exact authors on the papers because it doesn't look like people working within contemporary metaethics. It's this whole other literature. I saw it. I read a couple papers, but I didn't really dig into it too much. I could find it and share it with you later if you want. But yeah, there's this literature where there's this discussion about, hey, students are relativists. This seems like a problem. What can we do to sort of mitigate the problem and sort of talk students out of this relativism? That's just a literature. There's papers on this.
Right.
I find something strange about that. What I also find a little strange about that kind of literature is that a lot of it predates the contemporary psychology of metaethics research, where we actually have good measures. Have good measures. I critique all the measures where we actually have measures that are at least in the ballpark of attempting to explicitly and self-consciously measure people's metaethical views. I think they all are invalid anyway. But a lot of other stuff just relies on anecdote, self-report, and sometimes people rely on this old measure. It's the Forsyth Ethics Position Questionnaire, which
I know.
purports to measure relativism. But I think it was designed psychometrically for very different purposes than drawing substantive distinctions in people's metaethical views, because the items on that scale have very little to do with relativism as it's understood in metaethics. So it doesn't mean it's not measuring something useful. It's just that's not a metaethics scale. And yet I've seen people mention it and use it as a metaethics measure, and it's just very much not. I don't know if you've seen it, but it has items on it.
I have seen it. I remember, thinking that the same sort of thing.
Yeah, it has stuff like different people have different moral values. Like that's a descriptive claim. Of course they do. If you want to call that descriptive relativism, sure, but that's not a metaethical view. So
right, yeah.
So that's no good of a scale. Anyway, I think we got way lost. I had initially wanted to mention the Pulsar and Wright paper.
Yeah.
Where what they do is they give people a bit of training, like they train them to understand the distinction between propositions and non-propositions, so they kind of get where non-cognitivists are coming from. They give them more detailed response options. They really work to identify ambiguities and biases in the early instructions and earlier studies back from 2008, 2012 with like the Goodwin and Darley studies. And then having done all that stuff to improve the response options, the instructions, to give them a bit of training, to give them comprehension, like they have them answer questions to make sure they understood the concepts. After they do all that, they actually found a consistent, about 3/4 of participants consistently favored anti-realist positions, and in particular favored relativism, which I thought was really weird. Like that's a surprising result. I would not have expected that.
That was before my book came out, though, so I mean, it's like might be different now.
You're persuading everybody.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, I'm kidding. That's interesting. I haven't read the paper, but I should.
Yeah, it's a good paper. What's especially cool about it is that they use multiple different paradigms, and it's within subject studies. So the same participants answer different types of questions that are all intended to evaluate their metaethical views. And what they find is people give pretty consistent responses across the different types of measures. And that's the kind of thing ideally you would want with a good psychological measures, is if you have 5 different measures that are supposed to measure the same thing and you get the same results, that's at least some indication that you're probably measuring the same thing. I'm still skeptical, but it's like if I have 5 thermometers all saying it's 60 degrees, that's way better evidence of 60 degrees than if you have one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, just to kind of connect this with, some of the stuff I've been writing about. Um, I mean, it's like one kind of strange thing about the quietist, I guess you say quietist stance independent position like mine is that, you are committed to saying that there are right answers in ethics. They're stance independently correct or true. Some people are better at apprehending those positions than other people are. And indeed, it might be right to call some people moral experts and some whatever the opposite of moral experts are. But that there's nothing, and if you want to put it this way, sort of neutral or sort of independent of the domain in question, the ethical domain that you can point to sort of calibrate these people's ability at recognizing the ethical truth. And for most kind of paradigmatically objective domains of inquiry, it seems like you can find something that's like that at least has the appearance of being sort of neutral or external or some such. So whether it's general intelligence, whether it's like, if it's about apprehending objects nearby, it's like you can test your eyesight. If it's about, mathematical, finding out the mathematical truths, right? You can assess those abilities where those assessments seem like kind of neutral in some sense between the different sides of the dispute. Whereas in ethics, I just don't think anything like that is available. So I think from a kind of quietist point of view, I think I'd probably look at all that and say, I mean, it may be that people are sort of even after they kind of read my book or something, they'll still be relativists or like anti-realist of a more traditional stripe. But I do wonder how much they're being driven to anti-realism by this kind of background thought that there's got to be some kind of neutral way of calibrating intuitions or comparing people as like moral knowers in order for there to be objectively right answer, where like it's like a commitment of like basically a commitment of quietism. They're right answers and there could be experts, but there's no neutral way of doing it. I mean, it's different than other realisms, I think, in that respect.
So, but if there's no way to do it, is that a problem for you?
No, it just means that, my answer is going to be no. It's not a problem. Is it like, why do you think it would be a problem?
Well, it seems like if there's no there, so if I'm understanding you, there's no way to really determine or resolve if one person is more of an expert than someone else.
There are ways to do it, but it's kind of all from the quietist point of view within ethics, right? So for example, suppose I'm comparing myself to, I'm just trying to pick another, I don't know, somebody who I think is, whatever, somebody who I think is not as good at apprehending the moral truth. I could point to all of these differences between us, which I think make me a better judge of the moral truth, or maybe some. I think some people are probably better judges than I am of the moral truth. But suppose I'm the one I'm trying to vindicate here. I could point to things like my sort of empathetic powers. I could say things like, I don't know. I could like point to my like powers of like analyzing concepts or something. I could do things like point to I could say I have like lesions of my like, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and like that's good because like that helps me to like I don't know sort of ignore these things that tempt us into deontology rather than consequentialism. I mean, all sorts of things I could say. But if you ask me, well, why do those things make you better at judging the moral truth? It's just going to be more and more ethics, right? It's going to all be within first order normative ethics. I can't step outside of that and say, look, maybe we disagree about everything in ethics, but here, right, is like something drawn from like the theory of like, I don't know, the metaphysics of morality or the structures of concepts or something. Here's something that's independent of all that I could use to that we could both independently of our disagreements say like, yeah, that's right. That's the way of calibrating it. And I could say, oh, that shows that I'm better than better than you are at getting the ethical truth.
Yeah, I guess so. Part of my concern here is just methodologically, I'm not sure if or how you could resolve these sorts of disputes or like these disagreements in a way that would satisfy your critic. Because, if you point to, for instance, a brain lesion and say, well, you have a brain lesion, so that impairs your moral judgment. Someone could actually say, okay, well, actually, I think it improves it by suppressing some
No, I
bias.
think it improves it. I think it does improve it. I think.
Okay, so are you thinking of like dual process model, like Josh Green, and like
Yeah. I mean, like a lot
somehow
of things in that
damage the
area.
system for deontological judgment, we'd actually think better?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm just
I'm
saying
not going to
though.
stick a spike in my head. I mean, you know what I mean? But
Sure, but I can imagine a deontologist just saying the alternative. Like they could say maybe there's problems with like system 2 or whatever. And I don't know that there would be a way that to resolve that wouldn't be question begging or rely on presuppositions that other people would not be on some obligation to accept outside of normative ethical theorizing. Because if you're jettisoning all of the metaphysical considerations and sort of extraneous considerations, but like it doesn't hinge on those. It only operates within this. Like, what if they disagree with you about the norms or what's true or false within that domain?
good. So okay, it's like now we're getting into like the kind of dark underbelly, basically. But yeah, so like, I mean, just a couple of things about that. So one is, I mean, I kind of argue this in my book and elsewhere. I don't think that like the real concern here is the right way to characterize like the real concern is with begging the question, because everybody is in a position, it's like sometimes called the Agrippin trilemma, right? Where the options are, why, you say P, why is P the case? And either you argue in a circular way, or there's a infinite regress, or you just say nothing, it just is, right? There's always going to be some imagined interlocutor. Maybe it's the external world skeptic. Maybe it's, I don't know, whatever, Peter Unger or something, where you're going to be begging the question against that person. And so I don't think that there are concerns in the vicinity that I think are genuine, but I'm not worried about begging the question as such. Yeah, and I guess I would just distinguish between the question of like, okay, on one side, there would be questions like, are there any ethical truths? What are they? How confident I should be? And then on the other side, there'd be questions about like, okay, to what extent is it possible to convince even somebody else with very different starting points, right? Where I just can't even, there's no way in, right? That my side is correct. And I think it's at least a possibility that, yeah, like there are ethical truths in which I should be very confident. I can give explanations about why I should be confident. I'm not just like, I just thought of it yesterday, so I think it's true. I could give like arguments. I could like, look at my own freaking brain and say why I think I'm, doing well as far as apprehending the ethical truth. But were I to come across somebody with very different starting points, I wouldn't be able to convince them. And that doesn't reduce my, doesn't make me want to just suspend judgment. And I mean, I think some of the sort of motivation for this thinking that this could be the scenarios like coming from like the literature about peer disagreement, but a lot of it is just coming from the fact that like, look, as a quietist, I just think, and I try to argue for this, that ethical disputes are very different from other sorts of disputes, and so the failure to find some kind of neutral criterion that you could convince even the most ardent, opponent of, right, is not is not something that should make you reduce your confidence in the same way that your confidence might be reduced when it comes to other disputes. I mean, it's a weird position, right? I don't imagine that I'm saying this and everybody's like, oh yeah, of course, that's like totally obvious. But like, that is sort of the view that I came to. And again, I do think it's at least important in terms like distinguishing, just like drawing distinctions to think, okay, one question is, how confident should I be? And another question is, to what extent is it possible to convince somebody else? And then there's a real argument about how those two considerations bear on one another. Yeah, I'm blabbing on, but that's, yeah.
Yeah, because it makes me wonder, like, we both have this some sort of like quietist inclinations in certain respects, but they
Right.
seem to lead us to very different conclusions.
Yeah.
Realist thing. What I would wonder is how, like, from your point of view, presumably I'm making some kind of mistake. If it's not, I mean, maybe it's just a merely verbal difference, because it could be that whatever type of views you have about ethics wouldn't have the objectionable features that I find with non-naturalist accounts of realism that I reject. So, one thing I tend to emphasize, maybe not as often as I ought to, but I think often enough, is that I don't really have a huge problem with naturalist accounts of realism in terms of like the specific features that I really find objectionable, which is in particular irreducible normativity. That's my main problem in non-naturalist accounts. If naturalist accounts drop that, I don't have that problem with them, where I'm like, I'm not sure that the account is even meaningful. And I would want to say, I think Parfit's notion of external reasons is literally not meaningful. I don't have that problem with a naturalist account. I just see the naturalist accounts as failing to achieve the aspirations I wanted out of an ethical theory in the first place. It's like my problem with them, the naturalist accounts, is typically that they look like they're just going to furnish me with a relabeling of descriptive facts I already thought existed in the first place. So, well, moral facts are facts about what increases or decreases cooperation. Okay, well, and what if I don't care about that? Now, it's not guiding me. It's not compelling me to do anything to tell me that. It'd be very much like I go to a nice restaurant. I ask someone at the restaurant, like whoever is going over the menu with me, and I say, hey, do you have recommendations? And then they just describe the food like on the menu, and they're like, well, this has mushrooms and this has carrots, and I'm like,
Right.
well, but I already read that, and they're like, but facts about what you should eat are facts about whether it has carrots or not. I already saw that it has carrots. So you're not changing my mind. If they say, oh, it happens to be really delicious, I'm sure you'll like it, or this one is my personal favorite, or hey, I know about your preferences and I know this is more consistent with them than that one, that's going to get me to go, ooh, okay. But if they just re-describe the food, like let's say they just start re-describing the word carrot in different languages, and they're like, but I could tell you what a carrot is in 6 different languages. But you just mean carrot? Yes, I do. Okay, I can't do anything with that. And so the naturalist accounts, I don't reject those as nonsensical or false. I just say I don't care about those. And so I don't know if your position on moral facts doesn't fall within that, like if it falls within the traditional framework, I'm going to say the same things I would say about where it falls in there. If it doesn't fall into there, I'm not sure what I'm going to say about it.
Right. Yeah. Just real quick on the naturalism thing. I mean, it's interesting that, like, okay, so you're rejecting these kinds of non-naturalist views, like you mentioned Parfit, and like I guess like you think like Enoch is in the same kind of positing irreducible normativity, which you think is not just that there is no such thing, as you don't even know what they mean, if anything, by that kind of talk.
Yeah, just to be clear, when I first started talking about this, I would frequently say things like, I don't know what they mean, which the problem with that is that sometimes, especially when people are being super uncharitable, they take me to be saying something like, I don't understand it. And then as a result of me not understanding it, I'm inferring that therefore it's not true or it's not meaningful. But it's a little more complicated than that. It would be like, I would say it's much more similar to if you met a group of people that are mathematical dissidents and they insist like 8 is a prime number. And then if you ask them how that's even possible, they just say it's an unanalyzable truth. It's just 8 is a prime number and it's unanalyzable.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, but what do you mean? And they say, oh, shut up. We have the concept. And if you don't have it, maybe you have brain damage. That is how I've had non-naturalists react to me, where they're like,
Right.
the concept of irreducible normativity or an external reason, it's an unanalyzable concept. It can't be explained. We have the concept. We all know, look, I'm thinking and I have it in my mind right
Right.
now.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
we all have it. And I talk to my colleagues about it. And we're very smart people. And so since we all know we have it, if you don't have it, maybe you have brain damage. That is, I've had people literally suggest that, like, okay, well, maybe I do have brain damage. I've said to these people, look, I'm happy to help you write the grant to get the fMRI funding to start. I'll do the
Yeah.
empirical tests for you. I have damage to my, ventromedial moral cortex. If you want, they're not. I don't think they're very serious about that. I don't think they really care about the like. I don't. That's not plausible.
Right.
I mean, look, if someone could actually find that I have certain regions of my brain not functional, and they are functional in the brains of realists, but they're not functional in the brains of anti-realists, I would be happy to entertain. And I'm not kidding about that. I'd be seriously happy to entertain. Maybe I have some sort of conceptual problem, but I'm being a little bit hyperbolic. I've had some literally say that. Usually they call it something like conceptual impoverishment. So they'll say, well, you just lack concepts. And this is something that Parfit would say about his colleagues,
Right. Right.
that they
Right.
just lack the concept. But there's something deeply unsatisfying and shallow about that account. They just lack the concept. Okay, just lack a concept. No explanation for how or why. Just some people just don't have the concepts. And then the people that promote these views will say that the concepts are unanalyzable and they can't tell us what they mean. And then that's just supposed to be a property of the concept. Oh, well, some properties are just like that. My concern, I have many concerns with this, but one of them is,
Mhm.
how do we know that there's concepts like this, that you can't explain the meaning of the concept? How do they acquire the concept? Why? How do we know? So, like, introspectively, if you're conceptually confused and you're reifying some terminology or phenomena and thinking it's some concrete real thing when it's not, it could seem to you that that's a feature, it's a constitutive feature of the concept, and it seems very real and robust to you. But in a way, you're kind of conceptually hallucinating. How, in principle, could we distinguish cases like that from
Yeah.
cases where the concept is substantive, legitimate, real concept? And apparently, with realist concepts, they're super important too. These are like the most important things of all. You'll even have realists say stuff like, if we're not right, nothing matters. Like, nothing at all matters. There's no point in anything. It's just nihilism all the way down.
Yeah.
So these are really important concepts. But I haven't seen them give any standards or principles or criteria for how we can distinguish these substantive but incommunicable concepts from these, from just they're confused. So why should I grant that they're saying anything meaningful? So that's my concern with a lot of those views. So I don't want to say I don't understand them, because that there's a pragmatic implication there that I don't get it. There is something to get. It's just I don't get it. Kind of like if my mechanic
Right.
says, they start describing what they fixed in my car, I don't get it. But I don't presume the mechanic didn't
That's
do something
meaningless. Yeah.
substantive. Like, I'm not like, oh, well, I don't know what a carburetor is, so they don't exist. That's ridiculous. Or that it's nonsense to talk about car parts because I don't understand them. That would be absurd.
Yeah.
So I'm not doing that. I'm not saying I don't get it, so it's not meaningful. Technically, my position is that nobody gets it. So Parfit thinks he has
Yeah.
the concept of an external reason, and he's actually mistaken. He actually doesn't have the concept at all. Now, what's interesting is that Parfit explicitly acknowledges this. Actually, remember the page because I quote it so much. It's page 272 of volume 2 of On What Matters, where Parfit says, basically, look, William says I don't have this. Like, William says the concept's unintelligible. Parfit basically does not agree. Parfit thinks he has the concept, but he acknowledges, like, look, it's reasonable to think that if you think you have a concept, you do. And I grant that it's possible that I'm just totally confused. So Parfit at least entertains the possibility. But that technically is my position, that the non-naturalist moral realists think that they have concepts, but because the concepts are sort of meaningless pseudo concept, they don't really have the concept.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Sorry, I get, as you're talking about this, I feel like I'm on the border of like getting too excited about it, but that's probably a good thing. Yeah, I mean, just on that issue, I mean, I think there's a more general kind of interesting question about conceptual meaningfulness. I mean, in my own view, like when I come time to say like, okay, how do I like? I mean, I don't give a definition, but I say, what makes the concept the concept it is. I think the right way to do that is by kind of describing the functional role of the concept. And I think what's kind of distinctive about a concept like ought is that the functional role is a role vis-a-vis, and still stuff to be worked out, but motivation and emotion, things like that, right? That's what makes it the concept it is, not any kind of definition in terms of non-ethical concepts or any kind of inferential role. Now, if you say stuff like that, right, then people like Anscombe, and I get many people, but like I think of Anscombe in particular, will say, look, if that's all what there is to the concept, then there's not enough to the concept to determine an extension, right? It has, as she puts it, mere mesmeric force, right? And right, so I think the people maybe like Parfit or who else, Enoch or something, are not going to look at my way of characterizing the concept and see that as satisfactory. I think that's like the kind of royal road to like the concept not having an application. I don't think that's true. I mean, basically, I don't think any of these kinds of semantic questions are relevant to whether anything is right or wrong, and try to argue for that. But so my take, maybe has other problems, but I think it avoids this, what you're identifying, which is, you ask people what these ethical concepts mean, and either they say nothing, or they just give you other ethical concepts, right? In like the same small circle, right? A reason accounts in favor of, right? A reason, it's partly constitutive of what you ought to do, or it explains what you ought to do. Obligation, it's like ought, and it would be reasonable to blame you. I mean, all these kinds of things, right? Is that like you kind of like, I mean, maybe one thing to say is like people on this side that you're talking about, I mean, they do give definitions. It's not like they all say nothing, right? I mean, even when Scanlon says a reason it counts in favor of, that is, I mean, I hate to like stick up for the opponent, but like it is a definition or a characterization of the concept, right? You're kind of giving some sort of inferential role vis-a-vis other concepts. And so maybe one question I have for you, I'm just maybe more out of curiosity than anything, is like how you think that's different than other concepts, which I think you probably would take to be meaningful. Is there some kind of characterization of the concept of chair, proton, number, and so forth that's doing something extra that like what I mean? What that Scanlon is not doing when he defines a reason.
Yes. So it's a little difficult to characterize. And one thing I would say about this is that, well, I have my own views, although they're inchoate and they're underdeveloped. This is something that I should say, this view that there are certain conceptual issues with the non-naturalist character, like certain concepts among non-naturalist realists, which again, may or may not, it doesn't appear like you're committed to that particular view of moral facts. I do want to get to what you take them to be, so I can kind of assess them on their own terms.
Yeah.
So when we use terms like chair and table and those sorts of things, those all can be cashed out in a way where they allow me, I can make predictions with respect to the use of those terms. Like if someone says there's a chair in another room, I can anticipate future possible experiences. If I go in that room, I'm going to see something. Now, if I go into the room and I don't see anything and I go, where's the chair? And they say it's invisible. And I go, okay, well, can I touch it? They say no. They could start sort of systematically stripping away the supposed properties of the chair until I don't know what they are using the term chair to refer to. If it doesn't have any of the properties that I would have thought they were using the term chair to refer to, it makes me think of Carl Sagan's dragon in the garage. And so these terminology doesn't have to directly relate to like percepts or experiences, but it can indirectly relate to our experiences or possible experiences. And so for me, meaningful concepts are meaningful insofar as their usage figures into a broader network of terms and concepts where there are interrelations between the terms and concepts, where this term might be used in a way where you say, okay, well, what do you mean by this? I mean this thing. Well, what do you mean by that? I mean that thing. And it's part of a mutually interdefining web of terms and concepts that themselves bottom out somewhere in experiences, observations, states of affairs, the ability to make predictions, the ability to explain. They're going for me to have to bottom out in some sort of, they have to make a difference. In other words, they have to, and it doesn't have to be an actual difference. It could even be a hypothetical difference. You could say this term, I'm using a term to describe a phenomena about an event that occurred on the opposite end of the universe that I'm never going to see. But in principle, I would know what it would be like for that event to occur relative to it not occurring. But if you tell me an event occurred and it makes no conceivable difference to anything anybody could observe in principle, using any sensory capacities, any extrasensory capacities, it is different, but I can't tell you what the difference is.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's meaningful. Now, that might be a contentious view of meaningfulness because it comes out as a kind of, an empiricist view that would be similar in some ways to what pragmatists might say, what maybe I would have some similarities to what positivists might say. And a lot of, a prioristically inclined philosophers are not going to be very happy with that conception of meaningfulness. Fine. Table that or chair that if you want. Set it aside. And what is their account of meaningfulness? So they're using this term. They can't tell us what it means. Okay, what do we do with the term? Well, when I look at how they're using these terms, what I see is what I've described as a kind of terminological merry-go-round or a terminological Mobius strip. I think Mobius strip is better, but merry-go-round is maybe more visually. So what will happen is I'll say, what do you mean by this term? Like, what is it? What do you mean by a reason? Oh, well, a reason is something that counts in favor. Well, what does it mean for it to count in favor? Usually the buck stops there. They just go, well, if you don't know what that means, then I can't help you. Like people get grumpy with me. Now, if they do want to answer me, they'll say, well, it means you ought to do it. Well, what does it mean you ought to do it? Well, it means it's good. Well, what does it mean it's good? Well, it means you have a reason. So we just went in a loop. So A means B, B means C means D means A. Now, what I've had people say when I've described this sort of scenario is they're like, all definitions are like this. No, they're not. If I said, hey, I have headphones, and you said, I'm not going to just give you more words endlessly. I could show you the headphones, or here's some other, I already had them. And so my description of glasses isn't just an endless loop of words upon words upon words. It bottoms out in me showing you something. And so for me, I take a view of language's use. And I think that we use what we mean by what we say is an expression of our communicative intent. It's like we're trying to do things. I see it as a behavior. And I think that language largely bottoms out in pointing and grunting at things, like gesturing towards things in the world. It's like, here's the thing. And so for me, there are abstract notions like a center of gravity or something like that, where I can't point at a center of gravity. I can't point at the number 3, but abstract concepts and concepts that sort of relate the things in the world can be employed or used in ways that could make a difference in principle. My concern with these non-naturalist notions of reasons and that sort of thing is that I don't think that they do that. I think it's just a loop of words, and it's a sort of closed loop where there's never any conceptual bridge between the closed loop of terms and the rest of my terms and concepts. And maybe there is a bridge and I haven't seen it, but if there is that sort of conceptual bridge between what I suspect is a closed loop and everything else, all my other beliefs and commitments, that in some way sort of trails back down the sort of like the stream is back into the river of the rest of my beliefs, I haven't been convinced of it. And the more I've had these conversations, the more I'm convinced that it's a sort of inductive inference. The reason why I don't think realists can tell me what these concepts mean is because they don't mean anything. Now, again, of course I could be wrong about that, but what I've noticed is a kind of incuriosity and a lack of effort on realists' part. They'll say, if you don't have the concept, you're conceptually impoverished. Look, I'm not like a random person that just heard about this stuff yesterday. I've been studying this. I've thought about this. Now, am I specifically like a historian of the history of what non-naturalist realists say? No. So I'm maybe not as much of a specialist as them, but I don't think that, and also one thing to say about this is very much not like quantum mechanics or Fermat's last theorem or like really difficult, complicated topics where I would have to have a huge grounding in math to even begin to look at the equations for, like, I don't know, whatever quantum phenomena we're talking about. These are supposed to be readily accessible, immediately apprehensible in consciousness. Like this is supposed to be something that ordinary people all have. So it's simultaneously realists will say everybody has these concepts, and part of what the problem with me is that I don't have them. But like children have these concepts. So what's wrong with you? But also I need to study more to get them. Studying is not the issue here. So I think there's tensions in their
Yeah.
characterization of myself.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, it's, I don't know, sounds maybe it sounds a little bit catty or something if I say this, but like, I mean, I do think it has something to do with the kinds of incentives in philosophy that make people sort of talk in certain ways and respond in certain ways, and that like, kind of draw some people into the discipline and like cast other people aside. I mean, like, so to me, like, I mean, the question that you're asking is a really good question. And if I were on the sort of traditional realist side, I would, I would probably come back and say, well, okay, look, when you, um, when you ask to be shown something, right? You know, what is, I want to know what wrong means or something. Why couldn't I show you a picture of like, some southern sheriff like sicking attack dogs on a protester or something like that, right? It seems like it's bottoming out in some kind of experience. If you were to say, well, in other areas we can use them to make predictions, but it seems like on the face of it, those predictions are just things kind of couched in conceptual terms, like the fact that it's a prediction rather than a belief, I think is not always of the first importance. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you can say. I mean, I think my view about these things is like very similar to yours. I mean, ultimately what I end up saying in the book is like, what's kind of special, not about actually all ethical disputes, but that certainly the ones that tend to get called normative ethical, is that the relevant sorts of beliefs don't play the right sort of, like sometimes I call it a characteristically representational role vis-a-vis action, but also vis-a-vis non-conceptual representation, right? It's like there's like, to me, that's in some sense like the bottom is like representation that's not a matter of some concept applying to the world, but is sort of more like iconic, right? In the way that maybe a picture would represent the world, or a sound might represent, a similar, a similar sound, or something like that. I know this all to say, I mean, like, I think the real, like, I don't know, it makes me like, I don't know, I don't feel that bad for you, but like it makes me feel bad that like realists are like not saying more stuff about this, and they're just getting like, you must be whatever, have some kind of problem with you, because I feel like there's more stuff to say. Ultimately, I mean, I'm on kind of on your side in the sense that I do think that there is a difference between the concepts that, ought and reason and so forth, at least in the way they tend to get used, and concepts like chair and table vis-a-vis their kind of representationality. And again, I think I'd want to characterize that in terms of non-conceptual representation, and then also on the kind of role, as it concerns action, that I think representations have, but that non-representational things don't have.
Huh. That is going into an area that I think I'm less familiar with, like this idea of non-representational. You said non-representational concepts.
Well, there are two nons. There's like, so there's, so it really is like, so there's non-conceptual representation.
Sorry, I got it mixed up. Non-conceptual representations. Okay.
Yeah. So think of like, kind of, because I guess the kind of background thought, and again, I'm kind of, I don't know, some like, kind of doing maybe some realist homework for them or something, but like there's a kind of background worry that like, okay, even when you say things like, okay, the belief has to like bottom out in some kind of prediction or something, that if that prediction is still a prediction couched in purely conceptual terms, maybe the concepts might be in some sense more primitive, right? It might have to do with like the spatial and color concepts or something like that,
Mhm.
right? But it's if it's couched in conceptual terms, then it's still a case of characterizing some concepts in terms of other concepts, right? That is, like, you're not outside of the conceptual web yet, right? It might be a big web, right? And the fact that the mental states in question are predictions rather than beliefs don't that doesn't seem to that doesn't seem to kind of affect that, right? You're kind of still in the conceptual web, and then there's this question that I think, at least my way of putting it, but I think you were asking the same question, like, okay, how do we distinguish between conceptual webs where they're, one way to put it is meaningful, another way to put it is they're representational, they're playing a role in they're they're representing how the world is to the people in whose heads they're located. How do we draw that sort of distinction? And my kind of favored way of doing it is, again, in terms of, there is a certain kind of relationship with action that I think that representations or representational systems have, a certain kind of relationship with non-conceptual representations of the world that I think makes that like a conceptual web or system has to have in order to be a representation. I'm kind of influenced in just for the sake of the viewers or whatever, but in this by reading stuff like John Hoagland's paper Representational Genera, and like some of like Andy Clark's first book called Being There, which is largely like trying to like I don't know, like mediate between philosophers who traditionally been very impressed with the idea that, like, yeah, we act on the basis of representations, and then people who working in like non-representationalist AI and cognitive science, who thought, okay, should try to think about agency, but not in terms of using representations as as inputs. Anyway,
Yeah, it's
going off on a
it,
lot of shit there.
yeah. There's so many directions to go in, and for a long time I've been really comfortable talking specifically about the issues related to the validity of like psychological research, but it's largely within social psychology, and then some of the stuff is kind of similar in many ways to personality psychology, because we deal with like scales where there's like people do factor analysis on the scales, and you look at certain sorts of issues like that. But there's just this whole world of cognitive science, and in particular language cognition, that I'm super interested in, that I'm just sort of I exiting the world of social psychology while I'm finishing up my dissertation. I came across this stuff just in the past year or two, with I guess you could say fresh eyes, because I took some courses, like I took like philosophical foundations of cognitive science. I took courses 10, 15 years ago,
Yeah.
and some of that did something to me, but it's never been, one of the things about finishing up a dissertation and really learning one particular area very well is that for me, this notion of the illusion of explanatory depth, like people might say, I know how a watch works, and then you say, okay, explain it, and then they're like, well, there's like gears or something, like it's hard to do.
Yeah.
I've come to see that I am wildly underinformed about almost everything, even in areas adjacent to what my interests are, and this includes so much cognitive science. So I have a friend who's working on a PhD in cognitive science, and just every time I talk to them, they have new and fascinating things to tell me about research I'm not familiar with. But one of these areas is just concepts themselves, because as I became increasingly suspicious of the like external reasons and irreducible normativity, I started having people tell me that they have the concepts are primitive, which I find it to be a strange use, because my understanding of a primitive concept is it's a concept that can't be further decomposed to two or more fundamental concepts, which, okay, fine, maybe there's concepts like that, but I haven't been asking people to decompose their concepts. I've been asking them just explain what they mean. And I'm like, look, I don't have like specific criteria, just like you are saying you understand something, and
Right,
I just want to
yeah.
understand it. just whatever you could do to get me done. If it's do interpretive dance, if it's recite a poem, I
Yeah.
don't care. Just I want to have whatever thought you're claiming to have, and I
Yeah.
don't have it. So you got to do something, and I don't need you to say, ah, well, my concept is composed of the conjunction of this concept and that concept. So primitive seems like a misnomer for what. So in fact, I even had one weird experience where I asked a person what they meant. They told me it's a primitive concept. So I took that to pragmatically apply. Oh, well, I can't tell you what it means because it's a primitive concept. So I said, okay, but I don't understand like why you can't communicate the concept. And they're like, that's not what primitive means. It doesn't mean it's not communicable. It means it can't be decomposed into two or more concepts.
Mhm.
But you were the one that pragmatically implied you couldn't communicate the concept by calling it primitive. So what are you doing? So that was
Right.
weird. I got accused of misusing the word that they proposed that I use it that way implicitly. So that was weird. But
No,
yeah, so
yeah.
there's all this work where, you know, one of the things I picked up the book and then I never read it is Mashry's book. I think it's called Doing Without Concepts.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So have you read
It's
it?
it's a really valuable book. I mean, yeah, whether you agree with everything, yeah.
Great. So what interests me, and I tend to do this for a lot of terms, and I could say concepts, like the very concept of morality itself. I tend to suspect in a lot of cases that philosophers draw these very sorts of categorical distinctions where they'll say these are concepts and these other things are not concepts. And then if even at a superficial glance, if you start digging into how they're using these terms, I found this, I suspect other people would too. You immediately see it's a absolute quagmire. Everybody's using the terms in different ways, and no one's clear on what exactly the term is referring to. Like intuitions are a perfect example of this. It's not just that I don't know what a philosophical intuition is. I don't think philosophers know what they are. And concept seems like a perfect category for this. So if we're talking about various types of accounts or characterizations of concepts, I'm already going to start the discussion being very suspicious of what exactly we're even talking about, and suspecting that from the very outset we're dealing with really contentious territory. Do you have a stance on that? Would I be wrong to think that there's a lot of contention going on here?
No, I think I agree with that. So, you know, so one kind of at least, theme in Mashry's book is that philosophers and psychologists tend to be using concept talk to do very different things. I mean, it's more porous now that like people in philosophy are like aware of kind of various psychological right theories of concepts, right? But like when philosophers try to give definitions of terms, or when they say like in metaethics that ought can't be defined in non-evaluative or non-normative vocabulary. What they tend to have in mind is like that they're thinking about things like saying the right things about disagreement, what it is for two people to be talking about the same thing, right? That those are their kind of theoretical touchstones, right? But then if you look at what psychologists are doing when they say that concepts are paradigms or exemplars, for example, that what they're trying to explain is not what it necessarily when two people count as disagreeing or some such, that they're trying to kind of explain the way that people actually go about categorizing things in just kind of everyday life. What's the kind of process by which we I look over there and I say, oh, that's a plant, or I look over there and say that's a bird. And so it does seem like just because they're using concepts, or the concepts to do very different things. It's not clear that like these theories are kind of true competitors in the sense that they're being even like kind of measured by the same criteria. So like that seems right. And like for example, like I mean, I gave a characterization of what the concept ought it involves like before, and I said it has to do with motive, like it's characterized by its relationship with motivation and with maybe emotion, things like that, right? And for my purposes, that's that's like how I want to categorize it, right? It's like, but that's with those purposes in mind. If you were asking me, okay, how would you define, let's say, another concept like wrong, right? If what you wanted to do was, explain, people's categorization of actions as wrong as opposed to right. I don't think that what they do is, always go back. You probably hardly ever do this. Go back and somehow consult the motivational and role vis-a-vis emotion of the concept of wrong and then categorize it on that basis. I think they probably go back and they say, well, look, what are the paradigm constitutive kind of features of wrongness. I don't know. Does it hurt somebody? Does it undermine somebody's agency? I don't know. I don't have a theory about this, but I would do something very different than just be like, oh yeah, it's got to do with motivation. So I do think that part of what's going on here is that you've got these different camps talking about concepts and just using them and like using concepts and talk about concepts to do like very, very different things. And then, one thing I like about Mashari's book is like, he kind of has a foot in both camps. And I think he kind of brought some of this kind of like ships passing each other in the night, brought some of that to light.
Yeah, I find that I often agree with what there are people that work in or adjacent to analytic philosophy that will make critiques of various elements of it. And I'll find myself sympathetic to the critiques, but not very sympathetic to their conclusions. And I suspect that this is generally the case with Mashari and even people who I very much reject much of their views. Like one of my favorite papers is this paper way back from 2007 on X-Fi, like right at the start of experimental philosophy, from Kauppinen called The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy. Okay. It's a really cool paper. But what Kauppinen says in that paper is basically, hey, all these X-Fi people, they want to study non-philosophers' intuitions, like these folk intuitions. And yet, like philosophers, like what we care about when we're soliciting an intuition about a philosophical issue is you actually need the intuition to be about the issue. And so you have to rule out all these pragmatic features of ordinary language that might stand in the way of actually expressing a view about the semantics of a particular like sentence considered carefully. And so you need to be, I mean, first, minimally, you need to be competent at the relevant types of considerations, but you need to be free of biasing influences, pragmatic considerations, all these other sorts of things. And those criteria aren't going to be met in this typical survey. None of them are going to be met in the typical survey except minimally competence. And so this survey-driven approach is just not giving us the kind of data that we care about in the first place. But what Kauppinen, so I agree with that. That's like my whole dissertation says that. But then Kauppinen's proposal is, okay, but, in virtue of our being members, like speakers of English and being, we professional philosophers, we're already well situated to make judgments about these sorts of concepts. We don't need to do the empirical work. And that's where I very much get off the boat. I don't think philosophers are in a good position to get at those questions from the armchair. And I think that there's lots of psychological reasons why. So maybe one of my sort of enduring concerns, and I know we haven't gotten much in, and we probably have to wrap up fairly soon, about your proposal is one of the things I might worry about is that just as I have empirical concerns that I think are highly relevant to philosophical methods and theorizing in general, like, if Humer says, I'm a phenomenal conservative, if it seems to me that realism is true, or this particular claim justified in believing is true in the absence of defeaters, I don't know what Humer means by an intuition or intellectual seeming. Those seem like psychological claims. I want to explore the psychology of that. For me, what's relevant to the epistemic status of those claims is in part their sort of origins, like the genealogy. What psychological systems are involved? How do they work? It could be that, the visual system in the brain actually does give really good information about what the world is like. But we also have this system in the brain that evolved to facilitate adaptive behavior, but it causes us to hallucinate moral properties in the world. I don't actually think that that's true, but if it was true, that would be a problem. And how are we going to know whether the output of any particular intuition is the result of a reliable cognitive process or an unreliable cognitive process without cracking open the black box of the human mind and looking inside? So that the methods that contemporary analytic philosophers use, the ones that I think don't have the type of autonomy you're defending, those seem vulnerable to the empirical concerns that I have. And I would wonder whether your approach is equally vulnerable, and if not, why it wouldn't be.
Do you have any empirical concerns in mind exactly? Like, are you thinking about like debunking kinds of worries, or like,
It
yeah,
could be, yeah. So I tend to be really sympathetic, not to evolutionary debunking arguments, but to, I guess you could say, psychological or cultural debunking arguments. So in the case of the prevalence of moral realism, you may know, with the 2020 Phil Paper survey, the majority of respondents to that survey, was almost 2,000 professional philosophers, people publishing in philosophy, favored
yeah,
moral realism at 62%. Now, there are issues with that because it's like 50-50 of naturalists and non-naturalists, and they're very different from each other. So
right,
I
right,
already
yeah,
think that that's an issue to just put them together like that, because I have a lot more in common with naturalists in some ways than realists do. In any case, I think that needs to be explained. And so I don't think evolutionary debunking arguments are the best explanation. I think that there are various features of the history and sociology of philosophy that promote a high degree of belief in realism, and that the societies that analytic philosophers tend to come from, these societies steeped in history of like Abrahamic tradition and Christianity, I think that lends itself to a sort of residual influence of this dichotomy between good and evil, these cosmic forces of good and evil that have a sort of cultural legacy that we're still running on that sort of post-Christian inertia. And I think that that's huge influence even on secular moral philosophers. And so I think that there are cultural and sociological accounts, not evolutionary ones, that I can use to explain why non-naturalist realists would be non-naturalist realists without having to posit that they're correct. And I think that that goes some way in explaining like why people would continue to disagree with me even if they're wrong. So I
right.
don't know if if that has any relation to your own views.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, like, I think anybody who says that, I don't know, sort of anybody who expresses any ethical view, but certainly anybody who expresses the view that there are mind independent or stance independent ethical truths, right? Is you got to confront these sorts of debunking arguments. Um, uh, I mean, what I really want to say about like this kind of issue ultimately like rests on like a lot of, I guess somewhat sort of technical things that we're probably not going to have time to talk about. But I mean, I do think that a quietist like me, or a kind of sophisticated, quasi-realist like Blackburn or like Gibbard, like these kinds of Terry Horgan and Mark Timmons, that they're in a better position to respond to these debunking challenges, notwithstanding the fact that they're positing these stance independent ethical truths, that they're in a better position than like, let's say, a traditional non-naturalist realist. So my kind of basic position on these sorts of debunking debunking challenges is like, there are there are really kind of two types of challenges, and one kind of challenge is um, one kind of challenge is that we should be suspicious of some moral belief, and including the belief that there are stance independent truths about ethics, on the ground that there's no connection between um, um, truth or truth makers and belief in the way that there seems to be in other fields, right? Like if you said, well, why is it that um, why is it that my faculties of visual perception tend to like place things in the way that I do? That ultimately part of the explanation would involve a connection between truths about the locations of ordinary physical objects in the vicinity of my distant ancestors, and whether they survived, right, to like pass on their their genes, right? So um, so um, okay, so that's one kind of worry, that there's not like the right kind of connection. There's not a connection between like moral truth and moral belief, basically. And that's the kind of way of couching the debunking arguments that I think you see in like what I take to be the right way of presenting these debunking worries. So like if you read stuff like a paper by Dustin Locke and Dan Corman, paper by Matt Lutz, that they're like, look, this is the way to present the debunking worry, right? But there, and the, you know, basically my response to that kind of worry is like, is that, I mean, again, this is not going to be satisfactory, right? There's like a lot of theoretical background here, but basically I say like, yeah, and in order to respond to that kind of debunking worry, someone like me is going to have to say that even though there's no connection between like truth as such and belief, that nonetheless, you know, kind of, you know, approaching this given my first order like ethical beliefs, this is the kind of process that is likely to that is likely to, you know, instill within me or result in true ethical beliefs, right? So I'm a kind of, you know, starting with my, at least not all my ethical, but starting with some stock of my ethical beliefs, I'm looking at natural selection, or I'm looking at cultural evolution, and I'm saying, yeah, like this is the kind of process that is likely to you know, kind of result in people believing the moral truth, right? Like put it this way, the mere fact that something has a history, right, doesn't make the judgment as a history doesn't make me suspicious of it. There are other kinds of biological or cultural processes about which I would be more suspicious. So like, you know, I again, like I was saying before, I am a consequentialist. I look at some processes that led to people seem to explain deontological intuitions, right? And I look at those processes again from a kind of standpoint within ethics, because I think that's kind of all you can do when it comes to ethics. And these seem like the kinds of things that are unlikely to yield, you know, true views, right? So like the fact that they evolved through a kind of, you know, like model free, like sort of, you know, kind of history of training as a result of, you know, sorry, instead of, you know, being judgments that are based on a model of all of the different sort of possible outcomes from your action, right? So like, thinking of papers by people like Fiery Cushman and Molly Crockett, like that's something that makes me suspicious of those kinds of intuitions. But again, it's kind of rambling here, but like as I look at, you know, natural selection and, you know, kind of cultural evolution, yeah, like I don't think there's a connection between between truths in the sort of ethical domain and my current ethical beliefs. But I don't think that that's a reason to be entirely skeptical of those beliefs. And my general approach tends to be, yeah, look at these processes from within an ethical standpoint and say, look, are these the kinds of things that seem sketchy or not? And largely they don't seem sketchy. So I'm like, for example, I'm not suspicious of our intuitions that like reciprocal altruism is good just because you could give an explanation of why we think reciprocal altruism is good that doesn't in the explanation advert to the truth that reciprocal altruism is good. I'm not suspicious of this intuition because I look at the processes that led to us forming it and think, again, by the lights of my other ethical intuitions or just beliefs, that these are processes that are likely to generally kind of push us in the right direction. Again, I don't expect that to be satisfying. I mean, like, I think like philosophy is like one of these things that, like, you know, I can kind of give you like the spiel and then I, you know, try to argue for it in detail. But yeah, I'm not presenting anything that I take to that I expect all the viewers are going to look at it and think like, oh yeah, of course, like he's totally right. I'm totally on board with it. I just like, you know, I try to argue for it elsewhere. You know?
Yeah, just to be clear, I would never suggest that if I can offer a sort of causal or historical explanation for why someone believes something, that in and of itself like refutes it or shows it to be false. Like that would be absurd.
Right.
Like if
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
"Hey, we can explain the evolution," like I can explain the evolution of human visual perception. Does that mean I think we can't see things? Like that'd
Right.
be
Right. Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So I think if I'm going to give a causal explanation of like here's why I think people endorse this view or here's why I think people think this way, that needs to be supplemented with additional normative and epistemic types of considerations about why that may or may not be a problem. And
Hmm.
then and that's why I don't think that um, we could just do science without philosophy or philosophy without science. I can't just say, here's the science. Let's point to these facts about human culture, human evolution, or human psychology, and we can refute realists or we could refute this philosophical position. We're going to have to draw on philosophical considerations.
Yeah.
So for me, I don't know how much your view about the autonomy of morality plays well with like my approach to things. I'm not seeing. So here, kind of what's interesting is it looks like we have like our like descriptions of our views on paper. There's like features where they look the same, and then features where they look like diametrically opposed. But I'm not seeing huge disagreements methodologically or in practice that are jumping out at me. It looks, I see
Yeah.
hints of them, which is interesting to have both similarities and differences that seem significant. But I'm not seeing anything where I'm like, you're not saying anything where I hear it and go, that's completely out of this world. That's like, it's not like you're saying substance dualism is true. And then I'm just like, what?
Right.
That's not happening. But yeah, I just want to emphasize that, especially for my audience, that I am definitely not saying that if I can describe the history of something, that explains it away or shows it.
Yeah. I wasn't. I didn't mean to.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know, I know, I know. I know
Yeah.
you weren't saying that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I do think sometimes people slip into that mistake where like someone that maybe I don't know. Some people might make that mistake. I'm not trying to make that. I think we should probably be wrapping up soon. But do you have another few minutes, or I could pivot to maybe a question or two before we wrap things up? Or
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
cool. So one thing, and I guess we'll just move into territory where it's just not my wheelhouse quite as much, at least not these days. Is
Yeah.
that you? From what I'm understanding, I get goofy. Maybe I mix things up, but my impression is that you tend to favor more consequentialist normative ethical views over more
Mhm.
deontological ones.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So just to confirm, but could you say a bit more about that, like why that's the case?
Um. So yeah, I mean, this is like kind of project book number 2 in a way. I mean, I mean, basically, I tend to favor consequentialist views because I think that a lot of the things that deontologists tend to say are of significance are not in fact of significance. So, for example, anything like the distinction between acts and omissions, right? It's like ceteris paribus, worse to do harm than to allow harm to happen. That's a distinction that I don't think is of moral significance. It's tough to explain why, as a psychological matter, I don't think that I've just thought that for a very long time. But I mean, an argument that I've always been very taken with is Jonathan Bennett's argument for the insignificance of that distinction. Basically, Bennett's idea is like if we try to give something like an analysis or a characterization of the concepts doing harm and allowing harm respectively, to put it, I'll try to be quick here. His basic idea is, so in both cases, you comport yourself in some way. There's some kind of active will, right? And then there's some harm that befalls a person. And had you comported yourself in a different way, there would be a different active will. The harm would not have befallen the person when and how it did, right? And the difference is that when you do harm, most of the ways in which you comported yourself are such that the harm would not have befallen the person. Very few are such that the harm would befall the person. And you comported yourself in one of those ways, right? You punched somebody, but had you danced, they wouldn't have been harmed, right? Had you sang, they wouldn't have been harmed. Had you punched the air behind you, right? They wouldn't have been harmed. Allowing harm to happen basically is the opposite of that. Most of the ways in which you could have comported yourself are such that the harm would have befallen the person, right? And you comported yourself in one of those ways. And then Bennett says, okay, well, if that's what doing and allowing really come down to, as he says, um, then we can see that there's no moral significance to the distinction, because there's no moral significance to, how many other ways of moving my body or comporting myself are such that the harm would have happened, right? And there are ways of kind of bringing out this intuition. That's Bennett's basic argument. There are worries about the argument that Bennett, to his credit, is kind of sensitive to, but I don't think he does a very good job of responding to them. One of the things I'm really working on now, and yeah, sorry, this sounds like a plug for another book, but one of the things I'm really working on now is, like, I'm quite taken with the argument. I think that, like, there's a lot there, trying to really put this sort of approach to philosophy where you kind of try to redescribe the world in, you might say, more austere, kind of cold analytic terms, and then kind of reevaluate your common sense moral commitments, trying to put that on firmer footing. But yeah, like, that's the kind of thing that sort of tends to push me, or at least tends to make me more confident in consequentialism, is that when we kind of look at the world in what I consider a more kind of privileged way, a lot of these commonsensical distinctions that seem to be part and parcel of deontology, I think can be seen not to be of moral significance. So that's it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I feel like would be a whole area and a whole other discussion. Also, it's totally fine to plug books. And I should mention, I will put a link to your book. And is there anything
Okay.
else that I should be linking or referencing in the description of this video for people to have a look at? Like do you have a
Oh,
website or something?
oh yeah, I do. We're still recording, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So I mean, like, here I do have the book right here. So, like, the cover is sick, right? So this is the case where you should judge a book by its cover, because I know the cover looks good.
I love
Um,
minimalist covers, so as soon as I saw that, I liked it. So
yeah,
that looks good
nice,
to me.
nice. But yeah, so, like, I mean, you could have, if you're interested in this, if maybe you were, like, if you're a viewer or whatever, if you were convinced, okay, great. But if you were just like, wow, that seems weird, but maybe this guy has some interesting things to say, you can pick up the book. Otherwise, like, I mean, I've done work on, like, like, the questions about moral uncertainty. I mean, I've kind of since ceded the field to people who are, like, younger and sharper than I am, like, Will McCaskill and Toby Ord and Christian Tarzany and people like that. So probably leaving names out, but yes, kind of used to work on that. I have a website. It's www.andrewsepielli.com. You can look at that. But yeah, I mean, basically what I'm kind of doing for the next however many years is this book about, again, kind of methodology and normative ethics, and how the psychology and neuroscience of moral judgment sort of bears on that. So it is kind of, an empirically, I mean, I strive to have it be an empirically informed
Oh,
look at
cool.
kind of how to do ethics. Yeah.
Yeah, so I used to be really into like that kind of moral psych stuff. So I was really big on the Josh Green stuff back in the day. I'm assuming that makes an appearance there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's really cool stuff. I know I also kind of got ahead of myself where I'm like, go ahead, because you mentioned like I don't want to plug something, but I'm fine with that. Go ahead. Like if this is, these discussions aren't just for our benefit, they're for people to listen to. And
Yeah.
a lot of the substance of what our respective thoughts are not going to come out in a discussion. They're going to come out in books or
Right. Yeah.
papers, or where we've really had to sit down and really carefully consider our thoughts. Also, I should just say for many, many years, I just called myself a utilitarian, typically some type of classical utilitarian. These days, I think I've moved away from normative ethics so much that I've lost the drive to call myself that. So I kind of just
Mhm.
don't really discuss normative ethics very much anymore.
Yeah.
But you're not going to get a lot of pushback from me on it within normative ethics, I suspect. I've always found arguments from deontologists deeply unpersuasive. I have some sympathies with virtue theoretic approaches emphasizing that morality isn't all about actions and principles. Character matters, and cultivating good character matters. But like, even if you look at John Stuart Mill's work, Mill already said that. Like, of
Right.
course,
Yeah.
cultivating a
Yeah.
disposition to act reflexively, act well, and you don't want to sit there all day doing calculations. Like, what is the Benthamic calculus and how to like that wouldn't maximize utility. So I've always had those sympathies for as long as I've thought substantively about normative ethics. So you're not going to get pushback on me there, or with the empirical stuff. So there might be areas where I would just want to hear your thoughts just to hear them. But I don't think we've been really arguing with one another. If not that I would shy away from it if we had some substantive disputes, but yeah.
Yeah,
So
I
that
mean,
all sounds
yeah,
super cool.
I feel in a way bad about that. Maybe I'd be like too conciliatory or something. But like, I just, I mean, I, I guess one thing I say kind of very early on in the Pragmatist Quietism book, this like kind of metaethics book, is like there's there's my characterization of like what is going on in ethical disputes, to wit, they're kind of very similar to like that William James squirrel dispute, but we can be like tempted to mistakenly think otherwise, right? So that's kind of what I think they're like. But then the question of what kind of theoretical overlay to put on top of that is, I think, is a very difficult one, and it's not one that has, apart from in my book, received any kind of like real attention, right? So like, if you think that like ethical disputes are basically just like the ordinary dispute about whether there's a cat on a mat, it's kind of easy to see how to think about that in terms of philosophical theory. If you think they're the way that I think they are, it actually is not clear how to think about them in terms of philosophical theory. And I think that it's like we're in very kind of thin air, and it's very easy to think, okay, well, that shows that they just don't have objective or right answers, right? They're disputes without any kind of possible resolution. And I think it's very tough to argue against that. And my view is obviously something I put a different theoretical overlay on them, but I'm not really that, in some sense, not that far apart from somebody who thinks that they don't have right answers. It's just like it's a lot of very delicate theory that like divides what may seem like diametrically opposed positions. I often find in philosophy. I mean, I think you were saying similar things about yourself and the naturalist. Like in some senses, like you're kind of really close to them in a lot of ways, and then you just part ways in ways that seem super important, but also kind of late in the game.
Yeah. Well, I mean, simply because I think we've had a more ecumenical discussion doesn't mean I don't think we could identify points of disagreement if we were really seeking them out, and then we could fight about them. But yeah, I think this is a good place to wrap up. So what I'll ask you if you have any final thoughts, and then I'll just say goodbye to our audience. But did you have any final thoughts or anything you wanted to add before we close this out?
Nope, no, it was good. I mean, I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Okay. So I guess I'll just remind my audience, if you're liking this content, I know I mostly do live streams, but I've started to make more content like this. If you like this stuff, or if you dislike it, you can still subscribe. But if you do like the video, please like the video, subscribe, and I will see you all later.